Right now, your body's doing something incredibly violent
Yeah.
and, well, entirely necessary, actually, just to keep you sitting upright.
Yeah, it really is.
Every single second that you listen to this, millions of your cells are dying. Like, they are aging out, breaking down, and just being cleared away.
Right. It's a massive turnover.
And in that exact same second, millions more are being manufactured from scratch to take their place. You don't feel it, you don't hear it, but you are carrying around this massive, dynamic, completely liquid organ.
Mm.
And it weighs as much as a bowling ball.
It really does. About 5.5 kilos in an adult.
Right. So today, we are tracking the hidden life of blood.
Which, requires a pretty profound shift in how we visualize our own biology. We are all so conditioned to think of anatomy in these very strict geographical terms.
Like on a map.
Exactly. Like you have a heart and it sits in your chest. You have a brain, it's encased in your skull. But blood just completely defies that localization.
It's everywhere.
It is. It's an organ that touches every single other organ. It's a communication network, it's a supply chain, and a waste disposal system, all happening simultaneously in about 5 liters of fluid.
And our mission today for this deep dive is to explore what happens when that brilliant fluid system starts to break down in, well, the most vulnerable among us, children.
Right.
Whether you are prepping for a clinical rotation or trying to understand a diagnosis, or if you're just insanely curious about the microscopic machinery keeping you alive, we are going to completely reframe how you view childhood anemia today.
It's a wildly different landscape than adult medicine, that's for sure.
It really is. We are going to trace the birth of a blood cell in the womb, decode the wildly shifting baseline of a newborn baby, investigate the clinical clues hidden in the shape of a fingernail, and then walk through the literal life-saving mathematics of a blood transfusion.
So to understand the failure of the system, which, is what anemia ultimately is, we really have to start with the manufacturing process itself.
The blood factory.
Exactly. And the clinical data on where this manufacturing takes place is fascinating because it doesn't just stay in one location.
Wait, it moves?
Yeah. The production of blood, a process called hemopoiesis, is just constantly relocating during our early development.
I always like to picture this as a rapidly scaling startup company. Like, it starts out in the proverbial garage,
A
right?
great analogy, yeah.
And in human development, that garage is the yolk sac. We are talking about the 2nd to 3rd week of gestation here.
Very, very early on.
The embryo is barely even a cluster of specialized cells. It doesn't even look human yet, but it is already prioritizing the creation of this liquid organ.
Because the environment at that stage of embryogenesis completely dictates the product. The embryo is growing at this exponential rate, and the diffusion of oxygen from the surrounding tissues is just no longer sufficient.
Can't just soak up oxygen anymore.
Yeah. Right, it needs a dedicated transport system. So the yolk sac begins producing these primitive nucleated red blood cells. And these cells are enormous. They contain a very specific embryonic type of hemoglobin that's designed for that exact, highly unique metabolic moment.
But the garage is just a temporary facility, obviously. The embryo is growing way too fast.
Right.
So by the 10th week of gestation, the data shows the blood production in the yolk sac rapidly diminishes. The startup has to move to a regional office, and that regional office is the spleen.
And then, closely following the spleen, the liver takes over.
The liver.
Yeah, the liver becomes the primary site of hemopoiesis up to about the 30th week of gestation.
That's most of the pregnancy.
It is. Because the liver is this massive, highly metabolic organ. It has the physical space and the vascular infrastructure to churn out the sheer volume of cells a growing fetus actually requires.
Okay, wait, I need to pause here and unpack this. The sources use the term extramedullary hemopoiesis.
Yes.
So extra meaning outside, and medullary meaning the marrow. So before our bones are fully formed and hollowed out, our solid organs are doing the job of the bone marrow.
Precisely. The liver and the spleen are essentially moonlighting as blood factories, and the cells they produce are morphologically different from those early yolk sac cells. Well, they're smaller, for one, and they actually lose their nucleus before entering the bloodstream. Plus, they are packed with something called fetal hemoglobin, or HbF.
Okay, fetal hemoglobin. This is a crucial concept for anyone listening. Why does a fetus need a completely different type of hemoglobin than you or I have right now?
It basically comes down to a physiological tug of war.
A tug of war.
Yeah, between the mother and the baby. You see, the mother's blood and the baby's blood never actually mix.
Right.
They just flow very, very close to each other inside the placenta, separated by a thin membrane. So how does the baby get oxygen from the mother? The baby's hemoglobin has to be chemically stickier.
Stickier.
Right. Fetal hemoglobin has a much higher affinity for oxygen. It essentially reaches across that placental barrier and just rips the oxygen molecules right off the mother's adult hemoglobin.
That is ruthless. I mean, it's amazing, but ruthless.
Yeah.
The baby is chemically designed to steal oxygen.
It's pure survival, you know? But eventually, the fetus has to prepare for the outside world. So around the 20th week of gestation, the bone marrow finally begins to form.
The permanent corporate headquarters.
Exactly. And just before birth, the bone marrow rapidly takes over to become the absolute sole source of normal blood production. The liver and the spleen shut down their assembly lines.
So the physical location of the factory is settled. But, every factory needs a manager. Someone has to look at the supply and demand and decide whether to speed up the assembly line or just shut it down entirely.
Right, and the manager of this entire operation is a hormone called erythropoietin.
Erythropoietin.
Yes, and the primary sensors that dictate when this hormone is released are actually located in the kidneys.
Wait, the kidneys, not the heart or the lungs.
Nope, the kidneys. Which makes sense when you think about it, because they receive about 20% of the heart's total output with every single beat.
Wow, 20%.
Yeah, so they are perfectly positioned to constantly sample the blood. Deep inside the kidney tissue, there are these specialized cells acting as oxygen sensors. When the oxygen concentration in the blood drops, a state we call hypoxia, these cells react on a molecular level.
So let's dig into that mechanism. Because how does a cell actually feel that oxygen is low?
There's a protein complex inside these cells called hypoxia-inducible factor, or HIF.
HAF, okay.
Right. Under normal, highly oxygenated conditions, this protein is constantly being broken down and destroyed by the cell. It's like a chemical alarm bell that is actively being muted as long as oxygen is present.
But the moment oxygen levels drop,
the destruction of HIF stops. The protein accumulates, it enters the nucleus of the cell, and it binds to the DNA, which triggers the production of erythropoietin.
So the alarm bell finally gets to ring. The kidney releases the erythropoietin into the blood, it travels to the bone marrow, and essentially yells, "Turn up the production lines. We need more oxygen carriers."
Exactly. And the reverse is equally true. If you have too much blood, say, from a massive medical transfusion, the oxygen levels are artificially high.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so the HIF protein is destroyed, the erythropoietin signal vanishes, and the bone marrow factory just quietly shuts down its assembly lines. It is a perfectly tuned, closed-loop feedback system.
But, I mean, a factory can't build products out of thin air, even with a brilliant manager like erythropoietin yelling at the workers.
Right.
You need raw materials.
You do. And the nutritional inventory required for optimal erythropoiesis, which is just the creation of red blood cells, is extensive. You need bulk materials like protein to build the physical structure of the cell. You need specific vitamins, particularly B-complex vitamins and vitamin C.
Right.
And you need trace elements.
Trace elements always fascinate me, because we hear of iron all the time, obviously. But the clinical data specifically highlights copper and magnesium.
Yes.
What on earth is copper doing in my blood factory?
Well, copper is kind of the unsung hero of iron metabolism. You see, iron is actually toxic if it's just floating around freely in the blood.
Wait, really? Toxic?
Yeah, highly toxic. It has to be bound to a transport protein called transferrin just to safely reach the bone marrow. But iron can only bind to transferrin when it's in a specific chemical state.
Okay.
And copper is a vital component of an enzyme called ceruloplasmin, which physically oxidizes the iron, changing its chemical charge so it can latch onto that transport protein.
So without copper, you could have a warehouse full of iron, but you have literally no way to load it onto the delivery trucks.
Exactly. A copper deficiency effectively creates an iron deficiency at the factory level, even if you are eating plenty of iron.
That's mind-blowing. And then, of course, you have the heavy hitters. Iron, which forms the literal core of the hemoglobin molecule where the oxygen attaches, and folate, which serves an entirely different but equally vital function.
Folate and vitamin B12. We are going to talk a lot about these later when we get into dietary risks.
Yeah, totally.
But physiologically, what they are doing is acting as the architects of DNA synthesis. When a stem cell in the bone marrow decides to become a red blood cell, it has to divide and multiply rapidly.
Right.
And every time a cell divides, it must create a perfect billion-letter copy of its entire DNA code. Folate is a crucial chemical donor required to build the actual rungs of the DNA ladder, specifically the thymidine bases.
Okay, so folate is building the ladder. What does B12 do?
Vitamin B12 is the essential sidekick that basically recycles the folate so it can be used again.
So if you're listening and you don't have enough folate or B12, the cell tries to divide, but it literally runs out of genetic building blocks.
Yes. And what happens is the cell continues to grow physically larger, synthesizing RNA and structural proteins, but the nucleus is stuck. It can't finalize the DNA replication.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so you end up with this massive, clunky, oversized cell that often just self-destructs right there on the factory floor before it even makes it into the bloodstream.
It's honestly a miracle it works as well as it does. I mean, we have shifting factories, oxygen sensors, chemical oxidizers, and DNA architects all collaborating seamlessly.
It's an incredible system.
So to understand how this system fails, we first have to establish what normal looks like. And here's the biggest hurdle for anyone studying pediatric medicine. In children, normal is a wildly moving target.
It really is. If you apply adult laboratory standards to a newborn baby, you will be utterly terrified. The age-related differences are just profound. You have to read pediatric blood work through an entirely different lens.
Okay, let's start at birth. Day 1. When a baby is born, their blood is basically supercharged.
Very much so.
The normal hemoglobin concentration in the first 2 to 3 days of life can be as high as 20 grams per deciliter.
Right. And for context, a healthy adult male might hover around 15 or 16 grams per deciliter.
And their packed cell volume, or PCV, which, is the percentage of the blood volume that is actually made up of physical red blood cells as opposed to liquid plasma, can be 54 to 55%.
More than half.
More than half of their blood is a solid wall of oxygen-carrying cells. Why are they so overpacked?
Well, because the womb is a remarkably hypoxic environment.
No oxygen.
Exactly. The oxygen tension inside the fetal circulation has actually been compared to the atmosphere at the summit of Mount Everest.
Seriously.
Mount Everest.
Seriously. So to survive and grow in that thin environment, the fetus has to pack its blood with as many oxygen-carrying vehicles as physically possible.
But then they're born. They take their first massive gasp of rich atmospheric room air. The Everest environment is gone, and the data shows that the blood numbers just fall off a cliff. They really do. By the time that child is 3 months old, that towering hemoglobin level of 20 plummets to approximately 10.9 grams per deciliter.
It's cut almost in half.
Almost in half, yeah.
Here's what I find staggering. A massive 50% drop in hemoglobin in a matter of weeks is considered perfectly normal.
Completely normal.
A pediatrician looks at those plunging numbers on a lab report and says, "Don't panic, this is the physiologic anemia of infancy."
Right.
How does that steep drop happen without the child just going into shock?
Because it is a perfectly coordinated adaptation, the clinical guidelines actually outline 5 specific intersecting mechanisms that drive this drop.
Let's walk through the mechanics of this because it perfectly illustrates the concept of dynamic equilibrium. Reason number 1, the rapid growth of the infant.
Yeah, the baby is simply growing physically larger at a staggering rate. They're adding tissue, they're adding vascular miles, and the absolute volume of blood is desperately trying to stretch to fill this expanding container.
Which brings us to the second mechanism, which the clinical data calls dilutional anemia. This is about the plasma, right? The liquid portion of the blood.
Exactly. When a baby is growing that rapidly, the body can manufacture plasma, which is mostly water, salts, and proteins, much, much faster than the bone marrow can synthesize complex red blood cells.
So the liquid volume expands rapidly.
Right. Imagine taking a glass of rich, dark orange juice and just topping it off with a cup of water. You didn't take any of the actual juice away, but the concentration of the orange color is suddenly much lighter.
That makes perfect sense.
The red blood cells are essentially being diluted in a rapidly expanding ocean of plasma.
So mechanism number 3 for this plunging hemoglobin is a temporary shutdown of the bone marrow, like a biological vacation.
Yeah, think back to the manager erythropoietin and those kidney sensors. For 9 months, those sensors have been screaming because they are living on Mount Everest.
Right.
Suddenly, the baby takes a breath of room air. Oxygen floods the system. The kidney sensors are completely overwhelmed with oxygen. The HIF protein is destroyed. And the erythropoietin signal goes completely silent.
The alarm turns off.
Exactly. And without that hormone telling the marrow to work, the factory basically just turns the lights off for the first few postnatal weeks.
The fourth reason is a management handover. We talked about how the liver was the primary site of blood production before the marrow took over. Well, the liver also produced the fetal erythropoietin.
Yes, it did.
But after birth, that job has to transition to the kidneys. And the data notes that this transition from hepatic to renal erythropoietin production is pretty slow.
Very slow. The new manager takes a while to learn the ropes. It is a gradual handover of power that temporarily leaves the marrow without strong leadership.
And the fifth mechanism is arguably the most dramatic. We established that the fetus builds specialized red blood cells packed with that sticky fetal hemoglobin. But those fetal cells are structurally flawed for long-term use.
They are. They burn brightly, but they burn out really fast. An adult red blood cell will circulate for about 100 to 120 days before it degrades.
Right.
A fetal erythrocyte has a dramatically shorter lifespan of only about 80 days.
And if the baby is premature, like born before 37 weeks...
Oh, it is even more extreme. Their red blood cells only survive for 35 to 50 days.
So look at this perfect storm. If you're keeping track, you have a baby expanding in size, their blood is being heavily diluted by water, the bone marrow factory manager is on vacation because of the sudden influx of oxygen, the new management is slow to take over, and the cells the baby does have are dying off at twice the normal rate.
Exactly.
It's no wonder the hemoglobin gets cut in half.
It is a beautifully controlled free fall. And, you brought up premature infants. They face an entirely separate superimposed crisis known as the anemia of prematurity.
How does that differ from the normal physiologic drop we just talked about?
It comes down to logistics and shipping schedules. Iron, the crucial core of hemoglobin, is transferred from the mother to the fetus primarily during the third trimester. Oh. It is a massive, late-stage bulk shipment designed to stock the baby's warehouse for the first several months of life. If a baby is born prematurely, say at 28 or 30 weeks, they physically miss out on that shipment.
They don't get the delivery.
Right. They are born with their iron vaults essentially empty.
So they don't just drop their hemoglobin, they crash. Because they don't have the raw materials to build the replacements when the marrow finally wakes back up.
Precisely. They require immediate, aggressive nutritional intervention and often transfusions just to bridge the gap.
And it is not just the red blood cells that are shifting. The white blood cells, the immune system, go through a massive transition as well.
They do. The total white blood cell count in the first few days of life is incredibly high. It can be up to 30 times 10 to the 9th per liter.
Huge numbers.
And the fascinating part is the composition. This initial spike is heavily, predominantly driven by neutrophils.
Let's decode that for a second. Neutrophils are kind of the blunt instruments of the immune system, right? The first responders.
They are the innate immune system. They don't need to recognize a specific pathogen. They just see something foreign, engulf it, and destroy it using powerful enzymes.
Shoot first, ask questions later.
Exactly. And it makes evolutionary sense. A newborn is suddenly pushed from a sterile, protected amniotic sac into a world teeming with billions of bacteria. They need a massive standing army of generalized first responders.
But the data shows that this neutrophil dominance is fleeting. After the first week, the total white count falls, and the neutrophils drop away, while a different type of cell, the lymphocyte, begins to rise.
Right. Lymphocytes are the adaptive immune system. These are your T cells and B cells. They are the special ops, the memory cells.
Okay, so they are more targeted.
Very targeted. They learn to recognize specific viruses and bacteria and craft specific antibodies. As the baby encounters the world, gets immunizations, fights off initial colds, the adaptive system learns and grows.
And this lymphocyte predominance isn't just a brief phase, is it? The clinical guidelines state that this shift to lymphocytes continues all the way until the child is over 4 years of age.
Wow, 4 years.
Yeah. It takes 4 years of fighting off playground viruses before the child gradually builds enough memory to shift back to an adult-like neutrophil dominance.
It's a multi-year restructuring of their internal defense force.
Okay, so we've covered red cells and white cells. We have to touch on the platelets, the cellular fragments responsible for blood clotting. The data here introduces a really important geographical nuance.
Oh, this is a vital lesson in understanding reference ranges. Platelet counts in the first year of life generally sit at the lower end of the adult normal range. But what constitutes an adult normal range depends entirely on the population you are treating.
The clinical notes draw a very stark contrast here. For a Caucasian population, the established normal range is 150 to 450 times 10 to the 9th per liter. But the normal reference range established for an African population is 100 to 300.
And this is where clinical context is literal life-saving information. Imagine a doctor trained exclusively on Caucasian reference ranges practicing in a predominantly African community. Right. A perfectly healthy patient walks in with a platelet count of 120. based on the Caucasian chart, that doctor might diagnose thrombocytopenia, dangerously low platelets, and trigger a cascade of invasive bone marrow biopsies or unnecessary steroid treatments.
But based on the African reference range, that 120 is perfectly healthy. It is just their baseline.
Exactly. You must treat the patient in the context of their genetic and regional background, not just a universal textbook number.
Though the text does add an interesting caveat. It points to a specific study of Nigerian neonates, where the platelet count was 100 to 450, which was reported to be comparable to global populations.
Interesting.
Yeah, so neonates might start off on a more universal biological baseline before environmental, dietary, and localized genetic factors pull those averages apart in adulthood.
Which brings us right back to the central challenge. If the baseline is always moving, if hemoglobin plummets naturally, if white cells flip their ratios over 4 years, if platelets depend on your zip code and genetics, how do we ever confidently say a child is actually sick?
And that leads us to the core clinical definition. What is anemia? The medical definition is a reduction in the circulating red cell mass or hemoglobin concentration below the normal range for age and gender.
Right.
You cannot diagnose it without knowing exactly where that moving target is supposed to be. But the most profound concept in this entire deep dive is this single sentence from the guidelines. Anemia is not a disease.
It is arguably the most important concept in all of hematology. Anemia is never the final diagnosis. It is merely a symptom. It is a manifestation of an underlying condition.
It is a blaring warning siren. And, the terrifying part is how hard the human body tries to muffle that siren. The human body is so resilient that it will perform profound physiological magic tricks to hide the fact that it is running out of oxygen.
We call these compensatory mechanisms. The body has 3 primary ways to adapt to a dropping hemoglobin level, and they are all designed to keep the brain and the heart alive at all costs.
Let's break down the physics of this compensation, because it's intense. The first mechanism is increasing cardiac output.
Right. Think of cardiac output as the total volume of blood the heart pumps in 1 minute. The body demands a certain fixed amount of oxygen delivery every minute just to maintain basic cellular metabolism.
So if you have fewer red blood cells carrying oxygen,
the only way to deliver the same total amount of oxygen is to make those fewer cells run the circuit much, much faster.
So the heart rate speeds up. Tachycardia.
Tachycardia, yes. But it also increases the stroke volume.
What does that mean?
The heart muscle literally stretches a little further and squeezes a little harder with every single beat to push a larger volume of fluid out of the chamber.
Imagine the physical toll of that.
Yeah.
Imagine sitting perfectly still in a chair, but your heart is pounding and squeezing with the intensity of running a dead sprint 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
It is an unsustainable marathon.
Yeah.
And the second compensatory mechanism happens out in the tissues themselves, increased oxygen extraction.
How does tissue become more efficient at extracting oxygen?
It's a chemical shift called the Bohr effect.
Okay, the Bohr effect.
Yeah. As tissues become starved for oxygen, they switch to anaerobic metabolism, which produces lactic acid.
Like when you work out really hard.
Exactly. The tissue becomes slightly acidic. This localized acidity actually changes the molecular shape of the hemoglobin passing by in the capillaries, forcing it to release its grip on the oxygen molecule much more easily.
Wow.
The tissues become greedy. They strip almost every single molecule of oxygen off the red blood cell, leaving the returning venous blood completely depleted.
And the third mechanism is perhaps the most drastic: shunting.
The redistribution of blood flow.
Yeah.
The body has a strict hierarchy of organs. The brain and the heart are at the absolute top. If they lose oxygen for even a few minutes, you die.
Right.
The skin, the gut, the kidneys, they can survive a temporary drought.
So the body physically clamps down the blood vessels leading to the non-essential organs.
Microscopic muscular sphincters in the capillary beds of the skin and the intestines just constrict, forcing the blood to bypass them and rush directly back to the central circulation to supply the brain.
Oh, that explains so much. This is why a severely anemic child appears ghost white or profoundly pale.
Yes.
The body is literally stealing blood from the skin surface to keep the core alive.
Exactly.
But this brings up a terrifying clinical reality. Because the child's body is so incredibly good at compensating, because the heart is racing, the tissues are greedy, the blood is shunting, the child might look okay at a passing glance.
They might.
The clinical guidelines state that few clinical disturbances occur until the hemoglobin falls below 7 to 8 grams per deciliter.
That is the danger zone. The compensation is almost too good.
So if a parent or doctor doesn't see symptoms until the hemoglobin is below 8, Aren't we almost always catching this dangerously late?
Frequently, yes. When the compensation finally breaks, it breaks catastrophically. The
Oh.
child doesn't just get a little tired, they crash into full decompensation.
And the symptoms of this crash are brutal. Extreme weakness.
Mhm.
Tachypnea, which is rapid, shallow, desperate breathing as the lungs try to force more oxygen into a depleted system. And the heart, which has been running that nonstop marathon, finally just gives out.
We call it cardiac dilation. The heart muscle has been stretching and squeezing so hard for so long that the muscle fibers physically lose their elasticity.
Like a blown-out rubber band.
Exactly. The chamber balloons outward, it becomes flabby, and it can no longer pump forward. The fluid backs up into the lungs. It's congestive heart failure driven entirely by a lack of red blood cells.
And the clinical notes make it very clear that this entire process is uniquely dangerous in children compared to adults.
Because children are not just small adults. Anemia is far more common in pediatric populations because their homeostasis, their internal balancing act, is fragile and much less established.
For one, adults aren't trying to double their body weight in a matter of months.
Exactly. The sheer demand for iron and protein to build new muscle, new bone, and an expanding vascular system puts an immense, continuous strain on a child's nutritional reserves.
Right?
But the other major vulnerability is how their bone marrow reacts to stress.
The guidelines call it toxic depression.
Yeah. A simple bacterial or viral infection that might just give an adult a mild fever can be devastating to a child's bone marrow. The inflammatory cytokines released by the immune system to fight the infection can literally cross-react and shut down the erythropoietin receptors in the bone marrow.
So the factory just halts production until the infection clears.
Precisely.
So when a doctor is faced with a pale, tachycardic child and a critically low hemoglobin number, they have to figure out what triggered the siren. They have to play detective.
I do.
And the first step of that detective work is classifying the anemia to narrow down the suspect list.
Hematologists use several overlapping classification systems for this. The simplest division is whether the anemia is hereditary or acquired.
Under hereditary, the text gives the example of congenital RBC aplasia, also known as diamond black fan anemia.
Yes.
This is a terrifying condition where the factory is just genetically broken from day one. It never produces the erythroid stem cells.
Right. Versus acquired, like transient erythroblastopenia, which is that temporary shutdown we just talked about, often following a viral illness.
Then you have the etiologic classification, which simply groups the anemia based on the direct cause. Is it iron deficiency? Is it a lack of folate? Or is it hemolytic anemia?
Hemolytic being where the factory is working perfectly, but the red blood cells are actively being blown up and destroyed out in the bloodstream.
But the most powerful, visually striking classification is the morphologic one. This is where the doctor looks at the actual physical shape and color of the red blood cells under a microscope.
It is a literal treasure map to the root cause.
The key metric here is the MCV, the mean corpuscular volume. It is a measurement of the average physical size of the cells. Based on the MCV, we divide anemias into 3 distinct categories: microcytic, normocytic, and macrocytic.
Let's explore this map because the mechanics here are brilliant. Category 1, microcytic anemia.
Okay, microcytic, micro meaning small, cytic meaning cell. These are tiny, pale red blood cells. Why would the factory build small, pale cars?
Because it is running out of steel, microcytic anemias are almost entirely driven by a failure of hemoglobin synthesis. Hemoglobin is the dense red protein that fills the cell. If you can't build the protein, the cell shrinks.
And the suspect list for this includes iron deficiency, because obviously you lack the core atom,
Oh,
copper deficiency, because as we learned, without copper, you can't load the iron into the factory,
right.
and thalassemia, which is a genetic mutation where the blueprint for the protein chain itself is scrambled. But the most insidious suspect on the microcytic list is lead poisoning.
Oh, lead poisoning is a devastating physiological sabotage. To the human body, a lead atom looks chemically very similar to calcium or iron. It just sneaks into the cells undetected.
Wow.
Once inside the bone marrow, it specifically targets and binds to 2 critical enzymes, ALA dehydratase and ferroacrylatase.
What do those enzymes do?
They are the specific machines on the assembly line responsible for forging the protoporphyrin ring and inserting the iron atom into the center. Lead physically jams those machines.
It just breaks them.
Yes. The factory has iron, it has all the raw materials, but the assembly line is paralyzed, so you get microscopic, empty, useless red blood cells and a buildup of toxic precursors.
Category 2 on the morphological map is normochromic, normocytic anemia. Normo meaning normal, The cells are perfectly normal in size, normal in color. The factory is building flawless cars, but the lot is empty. Why?
If the factory is perfect but the product is missing, you basically have two options. One is acute blood loss.
Right.
The bucket has a massive hole in the bottom. You are bleeding out perfectly good cells from trauma or a severe gastrointestinal bleed.
And the second option?
Chemolysis. The cells are leaving the factory, hitting the highway of the bloodstream and exploding. This could be due to an autoimmune attack or a parasite or a fragile cell membrane, but the marrow itself is functioning normally. It just can't keep pace with the destruction.
The text also includes the anemia of chronic renal failure here, which makes sense. The factory is capable, but the kidney is failing to produce the erythropoietin manager to turn the lights on. And the final category is macrocytic anemia. Macro, meaning giant. These cells are huge, clunky, and fragile. And as we discussed earlier, the sources link this directly to folate and vitamin B12 deficiency.
It all comes back to the DNA. The cell grows, prepares to divide, realizes it lacks the folate required to replicate its genetic code, and simply stalls out. It swells into a massive macrocyte that is too rigid to squeeze through the microscopic capillaries without rupturing.
It is incredible how the physical shape of a microscopic cell tells the exact story of what a child ate, or what poison they were exposed to, or what genetic code they inherited.
It really is.
But to solve the case, the doctor has to pair that microscope slide with a grueling interrogation, the history-taking.
Section 4 of our clinical deep dive, the detective work. The clinical history is paramount. The text explicitly states HXX is important. A thorough verbal history is often far more powerful than any high-tech lab test.
And the suspect list changes entirely depending on exactly how old the child is. Let's walk through this chronological roadmap of danger. We start with neonates, babies in their first month of life.
At this age, the causes of anemia have almost nothing to do with the outside world and everything to do with the womb and the traumatic physics of birth.
Okay.
The suspect list includes intrauterine infections that damage the marrow or antepartum hemorrhage, where the baby literally bled into the mother's circulation before birth.
It also includes maternal fetal blood group incompatibilities.
Hemolytic disease of the newborn. This is where the mother's immune system recognizes the baby's red blood cells as foreign invaders, generates antibodies, passes them through the placenta, and systematically destroys the baby's blood factory before they are even born.
And there's one infectious suspect that the clinical notes flag with a massive asterisk, and it appears across almost every single age group we're going to talk about: malaria.
In endemic regions, malaria is the undisputed king of pediatric anemia. It is a profound, ruthless destroyer of red blood cells.
I think we need to dive into the mechanics of this because it perfectly illustrates hemolytic anemia. How does a mosquito bite drain a child of their blood?
The Anopheles mosquito bites the child and injects microscopic parasites called sporozoites into the bloodstream. These parasites don't attack the blood immediately.
Oh.
No, they travel silently to the liver. They invade the liver cells, hide from the immune system, and spend a week multiplying from a few dozen into tens of thousands of a new form called merozoites.
A silent invasion force just building its numbers.
Exactly. Then the liver cell ruptures. Tens of thousands of parasites flood the bloodstream simultaneously. Their only goal is to find a red blood cell, latch onto the membrane, and pull themselves inside.
That is terrifying.
Once inside, they eat the hemoglobin, multiply again, and eventually burst the red blood cell wide open to release the next generation.
And this bursting happens in synchronized ways, right?
Yes. Millions of red blood cells exploding at the exact same moment. This triggers the massive, shivering fever spikes characteristic of malaria, and it leaves the child profoundly, suddenly anemic as their oxygen-carrying capacity is literally detonated from the inside out.
So malaria is always on the list. Moving down the timeline, we get to infants. The baby is out in the world, growing rapidly. The suspect list shifts.
Right.
We add dietary iron deficiency as those maternal iron stores run dry. We add lead poisoning as they start interacting with their environment.
And as they become toddlers, they are mobile, they're exploring, touching dirt, putting everything in their mouths. The suspect list expands to include broader malnutrition, and it introduces a terrifying new category: helminthiasis.
Worms. Intestinal parasites.
Specifically hookworms. These parasites enter through the skin of the feet, travel through the lungs, and attach themselves directly to the mucosal lining of the small intestine.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they have razor-sharp mouthparts that physically bite into the capillaries. A single hookworm isn't a problem, but an infestation of hundreds of hookworms is literally drinking the child's blood from the inside, causing chronic, dripping blood loss that leads to severe microcytic iron deficiency.
Which carries right over into school-age children. The sources list hookworms, chronic GI bleeding, and toxic bone marrow depression from drugs as primary suspects. But this brings us back to the doctor's interrogation. How do they tease out these specific causes from a terrified parent?
They look for extremely specific clues. Gender is a massive clue. The text notes that G6PD deficiency and hemophilia are X-linked traits, meaning they predominantly affect males.
Let's unpack G6PD because it sounds like a random string of letters, but it is a massive piece of the puzzle. What is it?
Glucose-6-phosphate dehydrogenase. It is an enzyme that acts as the red blood cell's internal fire extinguisher.
Fire extinguisher, okay.
Yeah. Red blood cells carry oxygen, which is highly reactive. Under stress, like a severe infection or exposure to certain drugs like antimalarials, or even eating fava beans, free radicals build up inside the cell. G6PD produces the chemicals necessary to neutralize those free radicals.
And if a child has a genetic deficiency of this enzyme,
The fire extinguisher is empty. The oxidative stress ravages the inside of the cell. The hemoglobin protein literally denatures, clumps together into hard chunks called Heinz bodies, and damages the cell membrane.
that sounds bad.
It gets worse. As these damaged cells pass through the spleen's immune cells actually bite the hard chunks out, leaving a deformed, fragile cell that quickly ruptures, an acute hemolytic crisis.
All driven by a missing enzyme and, like, a dose of antibiotics. This is why the drug history is so vital. The clinical data explicitly calls out chloramphenicol, a potent antibiotic, noting its ability to cause toxic depression of the marrow.
The medication intended to save the child from a bacterial infection can accidentally turn off the blood factory.
The interrogation gets even more granular with the nutritional history. This is where modern parenting practices intersect aggressively with raw biology. The clinical guidelines highlight two specific dietary red flags. First, prolonged and exclusive breastfeeding is associated with iron deficiency, and second, goat milk is associated with folate deficiency.
These are crucial physiological realities that often blindside well-meaning parents.
It feels counterintuitive, though. Breast milk is perfectly natural. How does prolonged, exclusive breastfeeding cross the line into becoming a medical risk?
It comes back to the math of rapid growth. Breast milk is a biological marvel. The iron contained in human breast milk is highly bioavailable. The baby absorbs almost 50% of it compared to absorbing maybe 10% of the iron in cow's milk.
So it's high quality.
Extremely high quality, but the absolute quantity is low. For the first 6 months, the baby survives by combining this highly efficient breast milk iron with the massive iron stockpile they received from the mother in the third trimester.
Right.
But by 6 months of age, that internal warehouse is empty. The baby's blood volume is expanding massively, and the small amount of iron in breast milk simply cannot keep up with the math.
The demand completely outpaces the supply.
If the parent practices prolonged and exclusive breastfeeding, meaning they do not introduce iron-rich solid foods or fortified cereals at that 6-month mark, the child will inevitably slide into a microcytic iron deficiency anemia.
And the goat milk trend.
Goat milk is biologically deficient in folate compared to human or fortified cow's milk. If an infant is fed exclusively on goat milk, they are being starved of the DNA architect. The bone marrow stalls, the cells swell, and you get a profound macrocytic anemia.
The history-taking concludes by focusing on the presenting complaints, the actual symptoms that brought the child to the clinic. The general symptoms are exactly what you'd expect from a body suffocating at the cellular level: extreme fatigue, listlessness, irritability.
But the specific symptoms are the smoking guns. For severe iron deficiency, the text lists angular stomatitis.
Painful raw cracks at the corners of the child's mouth.
Yes, driven by the failure of rapidly dividing mucosal cells that require iron for their enzymatic pathways. But the most bizarre and tragic symptom listed for iron deficiency is pica.
Pica is fascinating and honestly horrifying. It is the craving and compulsive eating of non-nutritive, non-food substances.
Dirt, clay, raw flour, ice, paper.
Why does a lack of iron make a toddler eat dirt?
It is a profound, misguided evolutionary survival mechanism. The child's internal sensors are screaming that they are missing trace minerals. This biological desperation overrides the brain's logic centers, compelling the child to literally consume the earth in a blind attempt to find the missing iron.
Oh my
And
God.
tragically, eating dirt often introduces the very hookworms or lead paint dust that caused or exacerbates the anemia in the first place.
So once the doctor has the history, they move to the physical evidence, the exam room. The physical exam starts with a general inspection, paying specific attention to the mucous membranes. Why look at the inside of the eyelids or the gums rather than just the skin?
Because skin color is highly variable across genetics, and the body's shunting mechanism can make anyone look pale. But the mucous membranes, the conjunctiva of the eye, the nail beds, the gums, are translucent windows directly into the dense capillary beds.
So you can see the blood directly.
Yes. If the blood is rich in hemoglobin, those windows will be a vibrant, healthy pink or red. If the hemoglobin is critically low, those membranes will be starkly white.
The doctor is hunting for specific signs. Jaundice, for instance.
Jaundice, the yellowing of the sclera of the eyes and the skin, is the hallmark of hemolytic anemia. When a red blood cell is destroyed, the hemoglobin protein is broken down. The core porphyrin ring is metabolized into a bright yellow pigment called unconjugated bilirubin.
And normally the liver filters that out.
Yes, but if millions of red blood cells are exploding simultaneously, like in malaria or a sickle cell crisis or G6PD deficiency, the liver is completely overwhelmed. The yellow bilirubin backs up into the bloodstream and deposits in the fatty tissues of the skin and eyes.
They check for purpura, which are tiny purple bruises indicating a failure of the platelets. They check for swollen lymph nodes, and they palpate the abdomen, checking for organomegaly, hepatomegaly, and splenomegaly.
The physical, massive enlargement of the liver and the spleen?
We talked about this earlier. Extramedullary hemopoiesis.
Exactly, the physiological desperation. When the bone marrow cannot keep up with the severe demand of a chronic anemia like severe thalassemia, the body reactivates its embryonic factories. The liver and spleen literally swell as they desperately try to churn out new blood cells.
Wow.
Furthermore, the spleen acts as the primary graveyard for damaged cells. In hemolytic conditions, the spleen becomes engorged with the corpses of millions of destroyed red blood cells.
It is a factory and a graveyard working in overdrive. There is one physical finding mentioned in the clinical guidelines that is just structurally bizarre. Koilonychia, spoon-shaped nails.
The text explicitly notes this as a feature of long-standing iron deficiency. The fingernails become thin, brittle, and literally curve upward, taking on a concave shape like a spoon.
How on earth does a lack of iron in the blood change the structural shape of a fingernail?
Well, iron isn't just for hemoglobin. It is a necessary cofactor for dozens of cellular enzymes, including those responsible for synthesizing the tough keratin matrix that gives nails their rigid structure.
Okay, that makes sense.
If a child has been deeply iron deficient for months, that structural integrity fails. Normal mechanical stress, just grabbing toys or crawling, causes the weakened nail bed to buckle and grow concavely.
So it's a timeline.
It serves as a physical historical record. A doctor can look at a child's fingers and instantly know this isn't an acute bleed. This child has been starving for iron for the better part of a year.
So the physical exam is the patrol officer securing the scene. But eventually, you need the forensic scientists. You need the laboratory investigations. The clinical protocols dictate a highly structured, tiered approach.
You never guess. You run the first-line investigations. These are mandatory. They start with the FBC, the full blood count.
This gives you the raw data. The total hemoglobin concentration, the exact number of white cells, the platelet count, and most importantly, the MCV. It hands you the morphological map. Are we dealing with small, pale microcytes or giant, clumsy macrocytes?
The second mandatory test is the HB electrophoresis.
I want to understand how this works. How does a lab test tell you if a child has a genetic disease like sickle cell?
Electrophoresis is an elegant piece of chemistry. You take the child's red blood cells, break them open to release the hemoglobin, and place that hemoglobin gel on an electrically charged plate.
Okay, electricity.
Because different types of hemoglobin like normal adult HB, fetal HB, or mutated sickle HB have slightly different amino acid structures. They have slightly different electrical charges.
So when you turn the electricity on,
the proteins literally race across the gel toward the positive pole. Normal hemoglobin moves fast. Sickle hemoglobin, which has a bulky neutral amino acid substituted into its chain, moves slower. By looking at the distinct bands that form on the gel, the doctor can definitively diagnose the exact genetic profile of the child's blood.
The final mandatory first-line test isn't high-tech at all, actually. It is the MP film, the malaria parasite film.
A simple, direct, microscopic examination of a drop of blood spread on a glass slide.
Wait, I have to push back here. We have DNA testing, we have electrical protein racing, we have automated laser cell counters. Why is a doctor physically staring at a glass slide listed alongside these advanced tests as a mandatory first-line protocol?
Because advanced genetics won't save a child who is actively being consumed by a parasite.
Fair point.
In endemic regions, you do not have the luxury of waiting days for genetic panels if Plasmodium falciparum is multiplying in the blood. The manual blood smear allows a trained technician to visually confirm the presence of the parasite hiding inside the red blood cell and to quantify the severity of the infection. It dictates immediate, life-saving intravenous intervention.
Once the first line secures the immediate threat and maps the terrain, you move to the second-line investigations to pinpoint the exact mechanism. This includes the reticulocyte count.
Normal is 0.5 to 1.5% of the total red blood cells.
Reticulocytes are the freshly minted, immature red blood cells just leaving the bone marrow factory, right?
Right.
They still have a little bit of RNA left inside them.
Exactly. Measuring them is a direct stress test of the factory. If a child arrives with a dangerously low hemoglobin of 5, but their reticulocyte count is soaring at 10%, the doctor breathes a small sigh of relief.
Because the factory is online.
Yes, it is working overtime, pumping out baby cells to try and replace what is being bled out or destroyed.
But if the hemoglobin is 5 and the reticulocyte count is near 0,
then the factory is dead. The marrow has failed.
The second line also includes the G6PD enzyme assay to prove that the fire extinguisher is missing. And it includes the Coombs test.
The Coombs test is specifically utilized to rule out autoimmune hemolytic anemia.
How do you test if the body is attacking itself?
You are looking for friendly fire. The Coombs reagent is a specially designed chemical that binds to human antibodies. If you mix this reagent with the child's red blood cells and the cells clump together, it proves that the child's own immune system had mistakenly attached destructive antibodies to the surface of their own red blood cells, tagging them for destruction.
They also list a stool exam, which brings us back to identifying the microscopic eggs of the hookworm, or chemically testing for hidden microscopic gastrointestinal bleeding. And finally, the ultimate invasive procedure, the bone marrow exam.
If the peripheral blood doesn't yield an answer, or if the reticulocyte count is 0, you have to go to the factory floor. You insert a needle directly into the pelvic bone and aspirate the marrow.
Wow, that's intense.
You are looking for the architectural layout.
Yeah.
Are the stem cells missing, indicating aplastic anemia? Or worse, has the factory been overrun by a malignant clone of white blood cells, indicating leukemia?
There are specialized other tests listed as well. Liver and renal function tests to ensure the supporting organs and the erythropoietin managers are healthy, serum iron levels, and an interesting chemical marker called free erythrocyte protoporphyrin.
The text notes this is elevated in lead poisoning.
This connects directly back to what we discussed about lead jamming the factory machinery.
Exactly. Protoporphyrin is the empty chemical ring. If the enzyme ferrochelatase is blocked by lead, the iron cannot be inserted. The empty protoporphyrin rings just pile up inside the cell. Measuring that pileup is a direct, undeniable biomarker of lead toxicity.
It is a breathtaking level of diagnostic precision. But, knowing what is wrong is only half the battle. Once the exact etiology, the morphological map, and the severity are pinned down, the medical team has to act. They move to the final phase, executing a highly calibrated treatment plan to save the system.
Treatment is never generic. As the guidelines state clearly, treatment is dictated entirely by the etiology, the degree of the anemia, and the rate at which developed.
Let's start with the non-transfusion treatments. These are targeted sniper shots at the specific causes we uncovered.
If the history and labs point to a simple raw material shortage, microcytic cells with low serum iron, the treatment is the provision of iron and multivitamins. You restock the warehouse and let the factory do its job.
If the MP film shows parasites, the treatment is immediate administration of antimalarial drugs. Kill the invader.
If the Coombs test comes back positive, showing friendly fire from the immune system, the text points to corticosteroids. These potent drugs suppress the hyperactive immune system, stopping the autoimmune attack so the red blood cells can survive.
If the labs confirm hereditary spherocytosis, where the red blood cells are shaped like fragile spheres instead of flexible discs, and the spleen is aggressively destroying them, the treatment is surgical. Splenectomy.
You physically remove the spleen, you remove the overactive graveyard, allowing the misshapen but functionally oxygen-carrying cells to circulate unhindered.
And for the most severe factory defects, the genetic disasters like severe sickle cell anemia or total plastic anemia, the treatment is a complete system reboot, a bone marrow transplant, eradicating the defective factory entirely with chemotherapy and seeding a brand new healthy stem cell line from a genetic match.
But these non-transfusion treatments all require one critical element: time. Iron takes weeks to build new cells. Steroids take days to calm the immune system. What happens if the child doesn't have days?
What happens when the child arrives in the ER in full decompensated cardiac failure? The compensatory marathon has broken the heart. The hemoglobin is sitting at 4 grams per deciliter. They are dying of cellular suffocation right in front of you.
That is when the doctor must reach for the most powerful and arguably the most dangerous tool in the arsenal: blood transfusion.
The guidelines outline very strict, non-negotiable criteria for a transfusion. You do not give blood just because a number looks a little low.
Absolutely not. A blood transfusion is a liquid organ transplant. It carries profound risks of immune reaction, viral transmission, and devastating physiological disruption. The text reserves it strictly for cases of severe, life-threatening anemia, or in cases where the anemia is moderate but accompanied by acute, active blood loss, or when the child is already in decompensating cardiac failure.
And when they do decide to transfuse, it is not a guessing game. It is not an adult doctor looking at a child and estimating, just hook up an IV bag and run it until they look pinker. It is a rigid, calibrated mathematical equation.
The math is the only thing standing between life and death. Remember our discussion about the child's expanding blood volume? Their cardiovascular container is tiny. If you push hundreds of milliliters of dense fluid into a failing, dilated heart too quickly, you will instantly trigger a massive volume overload.
Right.
The pressure in the heart spikes, fluid is forced backward out of the pulmonary capillaries, and the lungs fill with fluid. The child will literally drown from the inside, pulmonary edema caused by the doctor.
So let's break down the literal math of saving a life. The transfusion formulas. The text divides blood products into 3 distinct types: packed cells, whole blood, and settled cells.
Packed cells are the most commonly used product for severe chronic anemia. The blood bank takes a unit of whole donated blood, spins it in a centrifuge, and removes almost all of the liquid plasma. You are left with a dense, highly concentrated sludge of pure red blood cells.
This is perfect for the child in heart failure because they need the oxygen carrying capacity desperately, but their heart cannot handle any extra liquid volume.
Exactly. Maximum oxygen, minimum volume.
The dosage formula for packed cells is given in 2 ways. The quick clinical rule of thumb is 10 milliliters per kilogram of the child's body weight. So a 10-kilogram toddler receives exactly 100 milliliters.
But for critical precision, the guidelines provide an exact algebraic calculation based on the physiological deficit. The formula is deficit in hemoglobin in grams per deciliter multiplied by weight in kilograms multiplied by a constant of 3.
And the text includes a vital definition here. Deficit hemoglobin equals the targeted hemoglobin minus the present hemoglobin. Let's run a clinical scenario to see this in action.
Let's use that same 10-kilogram toddler. Their present hemoglobin is critically low, sitting at 4 grams per deciliter. The doctor determines that a safe, targeted hemoglobin level to get them out of heart failure is 10.
So step 1, calculate the deficit. Target of 10 minus present of 4. The deficit is 6.
Step 2, plug into the formula. Deficit, which is 6, multiplied by weight, which is 10, multiplied by the constant, which is 3.
6 times 10 is 60. 60 times 3 is 180. The doctor orders exactly 180 milliliters of packed cells to be infused slowly over several hours, not a drop more.
It is calculated down to the milliliter.
The second blood product is whole blood. This is exactly what it sounds like. The complete package, red cells suspended in all their original plasma.
Whole blood is generally contraindicated for chronic anemia because of the volume risk we discussed, but it is absolutely critical when the child has suffered acute traumatic blood loss.
Like an injury.
If a child is hemorrhaging, they haven't just lost red blood cells. They have lost the liquid volume required to maintain blood pressure. Their vessels are collapsing. They need the plasma to refill the pipes.
Because it includes all that extra liquid plasma, the math has to account for the dilution. The volume calculation is different. The quick rule of thumb is double that of packed cells, 20 milliliters per kilogram.
And the precise algebraic formula reflects that exact doubling. It is deficit in hemoglobin multiplied by weight in kilograms multiplied by a constant of 6.
So for our 10-kilo bleeding child with a deficit of 6, if they needed whole blood to restore volume, the order would be 6 times 10 times 6, 360 milliliters.
The math ensures the perfect balance of volume and oxygen capacity.
The text also briefly mentions a third, historical preparation, settled cells.
Settled cells are a compromise. You simply let a bag of whole blood sit in the refrigerator until gravity pulls the heavier red cells to the bottom. You then squeeze off a portion of the plasma on top. It falls somewhere between whole blood and packed cells in its concentration.
And the dosage reflects that middle ground, 15 milliliters per kilogram. The overarching theme here is control. You calculate the exact deficit, you factor in the exact mass of the child, and you administer the exact fluid volume required to restore homeostasis without tipping the scale into overload. But I want to bring this entire journey full circle, because there is a profound physiological paradox hidden in this treatment.
The feedback loop.
Yes. Back in our discussion of the factory manager, erythropoietin, we learned how it responds to hypoxia. But the guidelines explicitly stated that erythropoietin is inhibited by hypertransfusion.
It is the ultimate double-edged sword.
If I have a critically anemic child, my human instinct is to fix them completely. If their normal hemoglobin should be 12 or 13, I want to give them enough blood to hit 13. I want them perfect. But if I do that, if I push their hemoglobin all the way up to normal with a massive transfusion, do I accidentally shut down their own bone marrow?
You do, and it is a catastrophic clinical error. The goal of a transfusion in a chronically anemic child is almost never to push their hemoglobin back to a normal adult or healthy pure baseline because of the kidney sensors. If you transfuse that child into 14 grams per deciliter, the oxygen sensors in the kidney are suddenly bathed in an overwhelming abundance of oxygen. The HIF protein stops accumulating, the alarm bell is silenced, the kidney declares the emergency completely over, and it shuts off all endogenous erythropoietin production.
You have artificially silenced the manager.
And without the manager, the child's own bone marrow goes to sleep. They become entirely dependent on the transfused blood, which will die off in a few weeks, leaving them right back where they started, but with a dormant factory. The clinical art of the transfusion is calculating a target hemoglobin, like the 10 we used in our math example, that is just high enough to relieve the heart failure and ensure brain oxygenation, but remains just low enough that it keeps the internal sensors slightly hypoxic.
You intentionally leave them just anemic enough to keep the factory manager screaming for more production. You use the transfusion to save their life today, but you rely on the physiological stress to force their own body to save their life tomorrow.
Medicine is as much about knowing when to stop intervening as it is about knowing when to start. You have to respect the internal machinery.
We have covered an immense landscape today, moving from the rigid, life-saving algebra of the emergency room back out to the wondrous, fragile complexity of human development.
We have traced the journey of survival.
We started by tearing down the idea of solid anatomy, recognizing blood as a massive liquid organ that literally moves its manufacturing headquarters from the embryonic yolk sac to the liver and finally settling into the hollows of our bones. We learned that the normal baseline for a child is a terrifying, plunging cliff face of diluting plasma, shifting white cell armies, and regional platelet variations.
We redefined anemia entirely. It is never a disease. It is a symptom, a blaring alarm bell that the body attempts to muffle by forcing the heart to run a continuous marathon and stealing blood from the skin to feed the brain.
We followed the clinical detective work. We saw how a simple question about whether a toddler was exclusively breastfed too long or was drinking folate-deficient goat milk can unravel a physiological mystery. We learned the evolutionary tragedy of pica, where a lack of iron compels a child to eat the earth. And we saw how the structural integrity of a spoon-shaped fingernail colonychia serves as a physical diary of a child's nutritional starvation.
We navigated the strict tiers of laboratory investigation. We saw why a simple, century-old technique of staring at a blood smear for malaria parasites remains mandatory alongside advanced genetic electrophoresis and autoantibody Coombs tests.
And finally, we broke down the literal math. The 10 milliliters per kilogram for packed cells to maximize oxygen, the 20 milliliters for whole blood to restore volume, and the delicate balance of calculating a deficit that saves the heart without putting the bone marrow to sleep.
The ultimate takeaway from these clinical guidelines is a deep reverence for the system. Blood is a highly sensitive, constantly adapting communication network. Anemia is simply its way of screaming that something, somewhere, whether it's a genetic flaw in a protein chain, a lack of copper on the assembly line, or a microscopic parasite detonating cells from the inside, is fundamentally broken.
It changes everything about how you view a simple finger prick or a pale face. I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, something that builds directly on the very first moments of our embryology discussion. We learned that the earliest recognizable process of hemopoiesis begins in the yolk sac at just the second to third week of gestation. The embryo is prioritizing the creation of this liquid organ almost before anything else.
The absolute beginning of the timeline.
But if you think about human embryology, you realize a profound mechanical paradox. At 2 to 3 weeks of gestation, the embryo does not yet have a functioning heart. It doesn't have a vascular network. Think about what that implies for human development. The biological imperative for oxygen transport is so impossibly high, the body is so profoundly desperate for this vital liquid organ that it begins manufacturing the blood cells before it even finishes building the plumbing or the pump to move them. The cells are born before they have anywhere to go, waiting in the dark for the heart to finally beat. What other incredible, invisible feats of evolutionary foresight are happening in those microscopic early weeks of life, just waiting for the right moment to activate?